Hi there. I'm recording this video to discuss Mark Herman's Plan Orange. Now, I noticed that for me this comes out reverse, so I guess for you it's reverse because I got my phone on that flit mode. But anyway, so the background for this game, I've mentioned it before, but I'll just quickly speak about it here because it's kind of relevant to my relationship with it. Is that I have Empire of the Sun, and I had it many years ago, and I had a wonderful night. I was working nights. I had one night where I tried to play the game, and I did play the game, and I've been looking forward to it for ages because I love Pacific theatre of operations in the Second World War games. There's something about the land, the sea, and the naval relationship and the island hopping strategy that I find fascinating, so different from continuous fronts on the ground and that kind of thing. And though there are obviously some similarities, so I was really looking forward to Empire of the Sun. Previous to that, I had played and loved Empire of the Rising Sun, and I still love that game. I also have had to compare it with another strategic Second World War game, but that was in the European theatre. Yeah, it was European Theatre of Operations, or Advanced European Theatre of Operations. So obviously that was European theatre, but it still had naval components. So there's, especially in the Mediterranean, there's some combined force invasions and things there. But so I had great expectations for Empire of the Sun because it had a lot of buzz, and I was getting into the card-driven games then, like Paths of Glory and stuff like that. But after playing Empire of the Sun, I was like, wow, that's an amazing game, but it's not for me, and I sold it because essentially what my experience was that because I found the Pacific theatre difficult theatre to judge strategy on, it seems clear for me what your options are and what to do when you have a land, you have a continental mass that you are trying to move across, at least in the main. And the Pacific theatre is difficult for me to get essentially naval strategy because naval combat, the naval strategy and that kind of thing revolves around either retaining a fleet in being and or sort of having one main force that can counteract anything your enemy can do and defend itself well against anything the enemy may throw against you, or dispersing your force for various separate operations and risk being defeated in detail. So it's classic wherever you're fighting a military quandary, but it's kind of highlighted at sea with naval forces particularly because, and I think most games reflect this really well, naval combat can be very swingy in the sense that on a misfortune, like say you don't find your enemy before they find you, you lose two carriers and they lose nothing, and the whole balance of warfare in that theatre is completely swung maybe from one way to the other in one combat. So you can lose a lot and gain a lot in single blows in the Pacific theatre, and so dealing with that strategic in my mind, and then having layered on top of that this card dimension was just too much for me, because with card-driven games, once you've gone beyond, say, your first play, where you're just kind of turning a card and going, oh wow, that's interesting. I mean, some people, I guess, will read every single card before they even play the game, and analyse them and judge, and that's a very wise thing to do. But when I'm learning games, I just jump straight in. And so after that first play, when you're turning over the cards and you're surprised and you're learning about history and then strategy that can be performed in the game, you have to learn and understand the cards, and so what is available to each side. So in, say, something like Empire of the Rising Sun, you have the board, you have your forces, you have production, so forth, and you can start developing you can think, right, this is going to be my strategy. You take a turn, you move your strategy that way, and your opponent does the same. They take a turn, they move their strategy that way, and you respond to each other like that. But in card-driven games, A, you're alternating, and B, you don't know what cards are coming up turn to turn. So you cannot, in the broad outline, you can determine your strategy, but you are also having to react and respond to what the cards are bringing to you, and they might channel you in a direction that you do not want to go, or cut off the route that you were trying to pursue. And so there's a whole other layer of sort of complexity and responsiveness that you're having to deal with, and I just felt that Empire of the Sun was an excellent game, but not for me, and I sold it. Then, as you saw, I was holding it, clutching it then. I bought it again not so many years ago, wanting to get back into it, so I thought, look, yeah, I want to give it another go. And it's the only game I've ever done that reacquired so far. So, but I haven't. It's still in the shrink. And then Plan Orange was a game that I saw on a sale, and I made a mistake. I thought Plan Orange was on a sale. It was another game that was on a sale. But anyway, it got me in a discussion with a friend. And I was saying, I really like I really like the idea of Plan Orange. It's kind of like a small Empire of the Sun. One could sort of get back into the Empire of the Sun system without the complication of the whole Empire of the Sun experience. And my friend happened to have 2 copies of it that he had by mistake, and he gifted it, Plan Orange, to me as a birthday treat for my 50th birthday. So thank you very much, Ines. It's a fantastic birthday gift. And I finally got it to the table a couple of months later, and the long and the short of it is, I think it's an excellent game, but I'm disappointed, and for similar reasons to Empire of the Sun. So let me go a bit into this, just sort of 3 steps. I think I'll speak about this. The first step is I'll talk about the game and the game design, then I'll talk about the specific, which is partly to do with Empire of the Sun, but also partly to do with Plan Orange, but partly Empire of the Sun system. Then I'll talk about this game and its components specifically, and then I'll talk about card-driven games in the Pacific Theatre of Operations. So firstly, it has to be said that I think this is an excellent game. Like I thought with the Empire of the Sun, it's a wonderful system, but not only that, it is very well designed in that as you're playing it, as you're learning and as you're playing it, you feel that everything's notched in very nicely. There's nothing superfluous, and you're entering in a, to use an analogy to mechanics, a well-oiled mechanism that runs well and hums away nicely as you're playing it. Now, one thing with that, though, interestingly for me personally, is that in a sense that recoils me a little bit, because in compared to some other games, like just off the top of my head, something like, say, 3 Days of Gettysburg by Richard Berg, which is a bit loose and unclear in rules, and the mechanisms a bit maybe a bit stodgy, but maybe a bit you got wheels moving, and then bands come flying off, and you have to stop and put it back on before you can continue play. So in comparison to this, in comparing those two, this is a much better designed game, but that gives me a sense. It makes me recall a bit in that I almost find it too dry, in that I find I'm being kind of locked in to a game, and then I have to operate strictly within those dimensions. Whereas the Berg game that I mentioned as an example is something that I feel like I'm being immersed more into a view of a conflict, and it might be fuzzy around the edges, but I don't feel quite so locked in. And that's really just a kind of like an emotional response rather than a reasonable one, because the reason says that, well, of course, Plan Orange would be is a much better game. Um, why do you have a problem with perfectly tuned edges? And I can't really answer that. It might just be something to do with the designer's personality coming through into the design, where it's kind of like, this is it, you've got to play it like this, and if you don't, if you're not tuned to this game and how it's going to be won, then you're not going to win. And I read that so this is the Plan Orange rulebook, and this is the Plan Orange C3I magazine, the C3I magazine featuring Plan Orange that it came with, and in there Mark Herman is talking about his design Churchill, and he says that somewhere. It's funny because it's just, you're reading along, it's a long article, and he just throws out this one sentence, whereas I should have found it beforehand, that's kind of like a little bit out of place. Particularly, he could have said it at the end, a whole paragraph to summarise it, but it basically is saying, look, if my games are made to be played well, if you don't want to play well, then learn the game and play well and go home. And fair enough, but then on the other hand, Berg's game is a bit woolly, and Berg, as a personality, kind of, got problems in that he sometimes exhibits like condescension to his customers. Okay, but that might be a defense mechanism against the fact that I think because he leaves things loose and some parts of it untied, he cannot claim what Mark Herman can claim, that this is a wonderful mechanism. If you don't get it, you don't get it, and get out. And so in the Berg game, I can I have space to breathe that I don't find so much in such a tight design as Plan Orange. So so already we have my ambiguity with this. I think it's a really wonderfully designed game, but that gives me pause, just emotionally, not reasonably. So yeah, and part of the excellence of it is it illustrates, and it illustrates also what I alluded to earlier about this swinginess of Pacific Theatre combat. So, but it's really beautifully done, because, for example, in the air-naval combat, you can swing from multiplying your combat factors by 1 to a quarter. In the ground combat, it's from 1.5. It's from 2, to 1/2. So in both cases, if you have equal forces, say 20 factors each, one may end up 4 times as strong as the other, depending on how the dice rolls go for each side. So in the ground combat, you might have 40 against 10, and in the air-naval combat, you might have 20 against 5. But you can see both ways it can be very swingy. Now it's less swingy in ground combat because there's more die roll modifiers, so in fact there's only one, and then maybe from the events, from the actual card in the air naval. But on the ground there's other things that can be factored in, those modifiers which will not give such a swing. For example, the defender will always be on 1 minimum if he's defending against amphibious attack. It won't go down to halving his combat factors. So, yeah, and this is another thing where it's such great design is in that if these are the tables for air, naval, and ground combat, there's not a whole bunch of modifiers. Ignore that bit. And that's my addition. There's a lot happening in a very small design space, and that is great. So I don't think I can really ramble more because I'm not very good at analysing things like that in a sort of simple way I can explain well to people. But just suffice to say that I think this is a wonderfully designed game. The way the cards interrelate, for example, you have the Americans have one more offensive card and the Japanese have one more reaction card. They have the equal number of cards, but that is the difference. However, the Americans' offensives give a greater logistics value, so they can be moving more material into their offensives than the Japanese. But except the Japanese the way they start with two cards, that they start the game by playing two cards before anything else happens. And those are their more or less biggest logistics value offensives. So they gain an initial gain, and then the US has to go on the offensive to take that back, which is essentially how the sum of the whole game. And so the cards play that out, but then the Japanese, they also have two counter-offensive reaction cards. So some of their offensive operations are baked into the rules as counter-offensives against the Americans. So again, this ties on that thing whereby the cards that you are dealt are going to dictate how and when you perform your offensives. So as a Japanese player, you have to know that those cards are there, and you have to count your cards to see when they are coming and when they are likely to come, and time your response according to that. Whereas the American, again, they're going to be doing the same thing. After a while, you have to know certain cards, like the American has a card that can enable them to move twice their normal distance on the offensive. Japanese needs to know, has that been or has that not? And it might come round again a second time. So you can see the card tracking is extremely important, and the dictation of the way the cards come out on how you are going to perform your war is also very important. And so it is really nicely designed into that game. It's instead of giving sort of a separate restricting rules in, say, Empire of the Rising Sun, not Empire of the Sun, the card-driven game, Empire of the Rising Sun, you could say okay, this is the basic rules, but then we have this rule restricting Japanese in that way, and this rule advantaging the US in that way. You just have it on the cards, and so it's presented to you as it comes, which is very nice. So I think that's enough about how great a design this is. And now for a negative, which is the map for the game just took the Empire of the Rising Sun, or a portion of the Empire of the Rising Sun map, and Empire of the Rising Sun charts and tables, and added some of its own strategic display things and stuff like that. And the same with the charts that come with the game, and that's all there are on the back page, are culled directly from Empire of the Sun. What this means is that you have superfluous information on these charts. So you have information which does not apply to this game at all. For example, the movement chart here, you have 3 columns on here that apply to this game. And then you have 1, 2, 3, 4 that don't, and it's missing 1 column which this game needs. It's not a huge thing, it's just the airship movement rate that isn't on there. And so my question is why? And I think the reason why they didn't adjust, and also with the map, just to give you the full picture, there's only certain places are playable on this map, so the US and the Japanese can never enter any of these hexes. There's a hex here which is the resource hex. It's completely irrelevant to this game, except there's one rule where it would have effect, but that is discounted by the fact that it's a port. The resource allows you to move in a certain condition, but also the port on that same condition allows you to move in. So marking resource hexes is completely irrelevant, and you can imagine as a beginning player you'll be thinking, but what does that mean? It's marked on the map, it's not in the rules, is it important, what does it mean? So I think that Although I imagine what they thought was, okay, we're just going to produce it as the Rising Empire of the Sun map and charts is going to get them used to Empire of the Sun because this is a training game for Empire of the Sun. Okay, fair enough, but this also could be a taster game for Empire of the Sun. And if you're faced with these things where you're kind of like, there's all this information, and a lot of it is irrelevant, and it's just kind of raising questions and distracting my eye when I don't need it. It might put people off. So yes, if you enter this thinking, I'm going to enter this and use this as a learning game for Empire of the Sun, those irrelevancies might help because it's already accustoming you to Empire of the Sun. I would argue no, it actually doesn't. Make it simpler, as this game is simpler, and then that stuff can be added in, or even just grey it out. So all the bits that are just Empire of the Sun, grey it out. All the bits here that are only Empire of the Sun, grey it out, so that it's there, and you can become habituated to it, but it's not distracting you from the simpler version of this game. And then, so on that account, I disagree with that decision, and then on the other account, that it might not be considered that if this is taken by a customer as a taster game, it could put them off, rather than as a pre-decided training game for Empire of the Sun. As a taster, I think that design decision could put them off. And I guess some of it's going to come down to cost. Like, can we be bothered to, or do we have enough cost to pay someone to make these adjustments? I don't think these adjustments would really take that long. And I think it would have been a consideration to the customer to do that. So that's my disagreement with production design rather than actual game design. The another thing in that respect is, look, this is the where's the rulebook on there? Here's the charts and tables on the back of the rulebook. Sorry about the glare, but there you go. And here is my photocopy of that, and then my additions to it. You can see there's tons, and all of this lists all the different ways you can move, and then replacements and reinforcements. It's all essential stuff, and even a tiny sequence of play, which, okay, the sequence of play has only got 5 steps. You might be able to remember that, but when you've played so many other games, and you're coming to this, and you have a memory like mine anyway, which it isn't terrible, but it's just different from other people's. It helps just to have those 5 steps listed, so you can say attrition. Oh yes, that's at the end, isn't it? It's not at the beginning, and so forth like that. So, and this is not specific to this game, but it's almost every game. I plaster my charts and tables with more information. Like, all this information is in the rulebook, but it's not summarised anywhere else. I don't just want the charts and tables. I also want this summarised. This is for learning the rules. It shouldn't be for passing through, just so that I have to remember each time how to perform strategic ground transport versus strategic naval move versus organic amphibious shipping point versus air ferry versus strategic air transfer versus air naval emergency move. Bang it on a summary, and there you go. So, as I say, not specific to this game, specific to all. Also, it's strange, isn't it, that you have the index, and there's 4 or 5 things on here which I felt were crucial. I can't think off the top of my head, and I kind of like, it's not in the index, but it's one of those things that, like, is it fleet train, A, B, C, D, E, F? Yeah, fleet train. It's not in the index. The fleet train is an odd thing. Okay, you can quickly flip to the page when you remember where the page is, which happens to be in the middle and not special units, and not at the end where you've got other special rules cases to do with geography. But it's there. But why isn't it not on the index when it's particularly a sort of a very different thing from other things? So that's just the usual gripes on charts and tables. I find, and I just had a posting on Commonwealth versus Habit of Victory, Napoleonic game on. Please spend a bit more love on these boring bits, and not just on the exciting, sexy bit of your game design. And the boring bit that really helps the player gets the least love by designers and developers, and that is charts and tables and summaries and indexes and contents of play all being well collated and comprehensive. So that's my gripe. It's one is the irrelevancies of information and on the charts and tables and the map, which I found very distracting, at least to start with. And also another thing I had was like in the game, in the rules it says, choose a headquarters, blah blah. In this game, there's each side only ever has one headquarters, and those headquarters are not likely to move unless someone invades their hex. So where they start at is probably where they're going to end up. And have I got this the right way up? Yeah, that's the right way up. So what this means is that the Japanese have a headquarters here, and it has a certain range of activation, and that range ends here. And the US has their headquarters here, and their range of activation ends on the Philippines and then sort of cutting across down here. Mark it on the map. Yes, it might be sacrilege to adjust the Empire of the Sun map, but for this game, those are pretty much fixed. And even if they're not fixed, for most of the game, they are going to be relevant. So just mark a little slight dotted yellow line. Otherwise, I had to put markers out for it. Otherwise, you're forever, counting. Oh, is that in? Because that might just be in or out. I can't remember. Another useful thing would do, you have it in some games, is to have what's the word that you call it? I can't remember what it is. But when you're driving distances, you sometimes have tables saying how far is it from Tokyo to Saipan? How far is it from Saipan to Oahu? Just one of those tables would be wonderful, because otherwise, again, you're always forever counting hexes, and sometimes 20 or 30 at a time. And that is very important in this game, because each offensive you have to check, is it 5, 10 or 15 hexes away? Is it 20 or 30 hexes away? So that would have been very helpful. Is it an almanac? No, that's not what they call it. I think you know what they mean. So, Planoise, that's it. And then, excellent game. Could have been more consideration taken in some boring presentation arrangements, and I think I would have agreed with a different decision. Re-entry to Empire of the Sun. So then the last thing is, it's a great game. How was I with it? And ultimately, it is this thing versus card-driven games and non-card-driven games. But I'm going to narrow that here specifically to card-driven Pacific Theatre of Operation games versus non-card-driven Pacific Theatre of Operation games, because I really like card-driven games in some situations. Like I recently played John Fierer's Ides of March and The Age of Bismarck, and I'm likewise with Pog and so forth. I'm perfectly happy with those as a genre and having a place. So I don't have a problem with card-driven games per se. But, and it's to do with my love and then my the challenge I have with the Pacific Theatre of Operations. Combining card-driven games with Pacific Theatre of Operations, I think, doesn't work for me. And it is to do with this thing, is it a card game or is it a board game? The way I see it is that something like Empire of the Rising Sun, which is a board game, and then you have Empire of the Sun, which is a card game. Empire of the Rising Sun, let's say it's like chess, in that you have your board, it's a pure board game. You lay out your pieces, your opponent has his pieces there, and you determine your strategy based on the board presence, the state of play there. Yes, you can, there are sort of production things happening behind the scenes that can bring in some surprises, but still that's along certain lines, predetermined lines, and we know it. Then you have a game that is not like chess. It's not a board game, it's a card game. And in a card game you have a hand of cards, it's secret, your opponent doesn't know what they are, and you don't know what you are getting on each draw. So it's more about bluff and surprise and response. So in chess you can plan 2 or 3 turns ahead, and you might have an overall strategy. Especially in a war game, you will determine your overall how you are going to run this war, and then respond to your opponent each turn. He takes his turn, what's he done, and then you respond to that. In the card-driven game, you respond to each card. And in a card game, you also respond to each card that is played because it's not there in front of you, so you can't think about it. You might be card counting and have some idea what your opponent could have, but you cannot see it. And so, yes, you could have a broad strategy and so forth, but it's a very different way. It's a lot more responsive way of playing. And of course, this is, I'm trying to sort of polarize these things for sake of clarity. And in terms of like Venn diagrams, there's a lot of crossover between a card game and a board game. But the basic thing is there's a card game, the information is hidden and surprising for you and your opponent because of card deals. You don't know what's coming next. In a board game, not. It's more out there and on board. It's in clear sight. And so I like both those types of games. I've got lots of war games that are card games, like Upfront and campaigns of Stalingrad, which I think are truly war games and not just card games. I have other games that are card games that are war themed, which I enjoy as well, but that's kind of a different thing. But it's still, this card game. I love card games and I love board games, but in the Pacific Theatre, for me it is too much because already in the Pacific Theatre, things can swing a long way. Depending on, even in a board game, even if you can see your opponent moves a piece that is a naval piece, and yes, it might be Fog of War, so it's a fleet, say, marker, but you don't know what's in that fleet. You move your fleet marker, and then you might have a search roll, you might not, and his fleet might be bigger than yours, and something like that, and so, or you might have equal-sized fleets, someone wins the search, another person doesn't, there's a surprise attack, and bang, someone takes a massive loss and another person gets a massive gain. So in Pacific Theatre, I think these fleet actions can be very swingy. And then you add in the card-driven game and the randomization of the card play. You don't know what the deck is going to deal you. You don't know what your opponent has as a possibility in response. And in face-to-face play, I imagine because I haven't played Planaris face-to-face yet, although I hope to do so with a friend who gave it to me sooner or later, if not with other people. I think that could be very exciting and very tense. But for me, that creates, and this sort of merges into my also discomfort with this game in the design, in that you've got this very tight and tensely designed game. You have to run very close, there's a very sort of fine edge. You have to run close to that edge and get on the winning side of it. And the tension is there because of the cards, not just your opponent's strategy, which ups the tension. And I don't know, it just, at the end of the day, it kind of boots me out and says, this isn't really for you. I think as a game, and like I say, face-to-face, it could be fun and an exciting game. But if I want to enter the space where I'm thinking, okay, this is my fantasy space where I am conducting the Pacific, the war in the Pacific, World War II, how would I do it? And my opponent is in the same fantasy imaginary space. How's he going to do it, and what is going to be the outcome of the conflict between those different strategies and ways of doing this thing? And I can't. Then I am immersed more. I feel in the game allows me to immerse more in entering that historical space. It might not be historically realistic in that I can't ever actually embody one of the characters in that theatre. Do you know what I mean? You're more a kind of like an amorphous. You enter this decision space and you're performing the decisions of many characters that are in historical reality. But still, I kind of feel like in Empire of the Rising Sun or something similar, I'm allowed to enter that imaginative space. I feel like I am enacting out that theatre of conflict more than in a game like this, where I feel like I am entering a game space of a contest that is going to come down to how the game is designed more than which is going to determine a lot of my strategy and game decisions more than I myself can do just by moving my pieces on the chessboard. And so that's what it falls down to. In summary, I think it's a great game, but unfortunately it's not one that I will be cracking out solo very often. I'm going to keep it in my collection because, like I said, I'd like to play it opposed, and I'd like to enjoy the game with other people and find out what they feel about it and so forth. And it's nice to have a well-designed game, but I don't know what it is. I suppose it's something like, you might have a beautiful car, and I know nothing about cars, but let's just say a Lamborghini or something. It's a wonderfully designed car, beautifully tooled, but it's a Lamborghini, and you're stuck with a Lamborghini, and that's what it is. And then you have an old banger that is a bit rusty, and it's not a wonderfully designed car. It's got some quirks of itself, but because it's not such a beauty, no one takes so much notice of it. It's a Lamborghini. He's got a Lamborghini. He's driving a Lamborghini. It's just like, I'm driving my car. I can do what I like in it. I'm not stuck by the fact that it is a Lamborghini. And I think that's me more. I want something that's a bit, I'm able to enter more as me rather than get taken over as it. I don't want to be the Lamborghini driver. I want to be Jonathan driving a funky old Watford. So that's it. That's me on Plan Orange and a bit about board games in general and me in general. But I put it out there because I expect that some other people share the same thing, or at least similarities. And so that's it. So yes. Tomorrow, Habit of Victory with another friend. Looking forward to that. We're playing a learning game. Having taken about a week and a half and been pouring through the rules, contradictions and inconsistencies and ironing out a game which I think I can play satisfactorily. Apart from that, I've now got underneath this camera Triumph Chaos First Edition. Yes. Now, I played this once many years ago and sort of got defeated by the complexity of it, and I'm getting back into it now. Really, sort of like I've been meaning to do it ever since. But you know how it is. You have so many other games to play, but of course with the second edition coming out, and reading about that, whetted my appetite very much to get back into this. And I'm quite sort of relieved to hear about the second edition, that it's a more streamlined game, but for a start it's a bigger map, so I'm kind of happy that I got this smaller map version that makes it more doable for me. And I don't really mind that it's not going to be as streamlined. I understand it's the same, the spirit of the game is still very much the same, so I'm quite relieved with that, because I often find I'm way behind the curve with games, and I hardly ever buy the latest and shiniest, and so it's kind of nice when you can do that, to feel it's kind of like an immediate community. If all the new Triumph of Chaos Second Edition players are playing it, you're kind of instantly in some kind of worldwide community of that happening. And so I don't know. At least vicariously, I can join in with that with the old first edition. Get some of that new old excitement sort of falling off onto this too. But anyway, so I'm looking forward to that. I think again this is a great design, but it's a bit more on the Bergian rather than the Hermian end of things, I think, which is interesting since the designer's friends with Mark Herman. There's that video of them playing it together. But maybe his Herman influence has made it a bit of a tighter machine in the second edition. But it's funny because with the second edition there's some no, I won't go into that, but it feeds into the thing of this hobby is driven by the passion of the designers who design the games, and that is very important. But sometimes I think it's all forgotten a bit that it's also driven by the passion of the players who play the games. And one of the very unsexy bits of design is the boring rules, collation, compilation, proofing, and charts and tables design and making comprehensive, and it's making the game accessible to the player, the customer, not to the playtesters, not to the designer, not to the developer. And this game I suffered a bit from that, and no wonder, because I think it's quite a complicated game. But I think what tends to happen is that the designer has all this passion. It takes a long time to develop the game, and by the time they get to the end of that space, there's this generally a shorter period of time of production where the production has to get right. The rules have to be written and edited and proofed, and the charts and tables, so forth, and the map and all the pieces, and that has to be all made as perfectly in line to intention and each other as possible. And I think the trouble is that because this is at the end of the process, and it's not as exciting as the whole other design process where the designer and so forth and players and testers and all that are immersed in the history and suggestions, and it's a sort of more sexy time, that last bit gets short shrift, probably because the designer's running out of steam anyway, and perhaps time. And that is a shame, and I think our hobby needs to start paying more attention to that last bit and give it equal importance to the sexy part of game design. And with that, I'll get off my soapbox and say adieu. Overland.